According to President Trump, a new dawn in the Middle East was about to begin on the White House's sunlit lawn, and according to Trump, this new morning began without a drop of blood. The three Arab states have for decades entered into diplomatic and trade agreements with rival Israel, marking a historic shift in their foreign policy. However, as the Israeli Prime Minister presented a new roadmap for peace, significant changes took place. Instead of peace, a new circle is emerging that includes a new arms race. The first Arab country to soften relations with Israel was the United Arab Emirates, which is now very close to a fighter jet deal with the United States. Israel, which is already far ahead in terms of military power, can now try to increase its power further. The U.S. administration sees Iran as a global threat, and in its efforts to isolate it, it sees arms sales in the Middle East as balancing the power of its allies against Iran. The situation could spark a new unrest in the Middle East, where major powers are waging proxy wars, with the nuclear arms race raising fears of further bloodshed. But how did the fortress of arms claims for peace open? A matter of honor. The F-35 Lightning II, built by American defense company Lockheed Martin, is the world's most advanced multi-role fighter. According to Jason Bronk of the Royal United Services Institute, a UK-based think tank, this is extraordinary. The UAE has been working for the past 6 years to buy the plane from Washington to become the first Arab country to have such a state-of-the-art fighter jet. Citing the computing power of the F-35, its ability to deliver cyber payloads, to jam enemy air defenses and to carry conventional missiles, Jason Bronk said the U.S. Air Force has been using the aircraft for the past 20 years. I have introduced many changes that we cannot even think of today that a fighter jet is capable of doing all this. According to him, the purpose of this aircraft has become a matter of honor and dignity for the United Arab Emirates. According to reports broadcast on U.S. media on Thursday, the Trump administration has informed Congress of its plan to sell 50 F-35s to the United Arab Emirates. The total value of these aircraft is up to $10.4 billion. The good news for the UAE after many years is that significant progress has been made in this regard. Overcoming obstacles. Under a deal struck by President Trump in August, the UAE is the third country in the Arab world and the first in the Gulf to sign an agreement to normalize relations with Israel. It is important for Israelis to make themselves acceptable in the region and establish a new trade relationship. For the UAE, this means improving its economy and gaining access to security and cyber superpowers in the region. The Palestinians have vehemently opposed the move, calling it a betrayal of Arab solidarity and a blow to their hopes of becoming a state. And now other issues have begun to arise. UAE Minister of State for Foreign Affairs Anwar Gargash said the peace deal would remove all obstacles to the sale of F-35s, but also stressed the need to buy them. The application is not subject to this agreement. UAE officials point out that there is no military aspect to the agreement with Israel. Washington's tone has also changed regarding the possible sale of F-35 aircraft to the United Arab Emirates. Acknowledging the request from the UAE, President Trump said it was being considered, while Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and advisor, said the deal had increased the chances of success. In addition, the UAE has been trying for years to buy US-made MQ-9 Raptor drones, but has been opposed by an arms embargo. Bronxgen says the White House wants to stop the sale of Chinese-made drones. Armed drones have come out of the bottle, so could arms deals of this nature affect the balance of power in the Middle East in any way? Many in Israel are strongly opposed to the sale of F-35s to the UAE and worry that the deal will affect Israel's lead in the region. U.S. law stipulates that no arms deals will be made in the Middle East that would affect the Israeli military standard defense superiority over its Arab neighbors. That is, Israel's military superiority in the region will be maintained. Because of this U.S. law, Israel is the only country in the Middle East to have been provided with F-35s 4 years ago, and by 2024 it will have a total of 50 F-35s valued at $100 million per aircraft. The Israeli Air Force said in May 2018 that it was the first country to use F-35s in combat operations, including targeting Iranian targets in Syria. The release of images of an F-35 flying over the Lebanese capital, Beirut, sparked criticism as tensions between Israel and Lebanon escalate and the two countries are still at war. A political issue arose within Israel following Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's secret support for the proposed sale of the F-35 to the United Arab Emirates in Israeli newspapers and later in the U.S. media. The Israeli Prime Minister's office vehemently denied the reports and issued a lengthy statement stating that the Israeli Prime Minister had consistently opposed Washington's sale of the planes to the United Arab Emirates. The whole affair has been tantamount to fueling Israel's crisis-ridden politics as fears are mounting that Israel's dominance in the region will diminish. Israeli Defense Minister and Netanyahu's political rival Benny Gantz fled to Washington after the news broke to make sure that even after the sale of F-35s to the United Arab Emirates, Israel's military superiority and power continued. There will be no effect. The Israeli government has now dropped its opposition to the sale of F-35s to the United Arab Emirates. A newspaper considered close to the government reported that the Israeli Prime Minister had gone to Washington with a shopping list to buy the latest weapons. It is said that the shopping list of Israeli-American weapons includes V-22 upper tilt rotor fighter jets, F-15 fighter jets and laser-guided missiles. Meanwhile, 2 U.S. lawmakers have called on Congress to provide Israel with 30,000 pounds or 14,000 kilograms of GBU bunker buster bombs. Former Israeli Defense Ministry official Major General Amos Gilad, who is openly critical of Netanyahu, says the defense minister has tried to reduce political damage. He told a newspaper that the problem was not with the UAE but with what other Arab countries were going to get. He was speaking on condition of anonymity because he was not authorized to speak to the media. Qatar has also requested the purchase of the aircraft, while Bahrain, which has signed an agreement with the United Arab Emirates as well as Israel, is also keen to purchase advanced defense weapons and technology from the United States. Many fear that these arms deals could increase tensions in the region. Green JHN for human rights violations. D. William Herding, of the Center for International Policy, set up by left-wing peace activists in the United States after the Vietnam War, says the United States is now in the Middle East's own arms race. He called Washington's agreement with Israel and the Arab League an arms deal with the Ibrahim Accords. He said the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan, which are establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, would also seek access to U.S. arms factories. Making state-of-the-art U.S. aircraft available to Gulf countries would mean endorsing their policies. He said that this would mean turning a blind eye to human rights violations and abuses in the Gulf countries, especially in Saudi Arabia, where the situation is extremely serious. Meanwhile, human rights groups have expressed grave concern over the situation in Yemen, which has been devastated by the war against Saudi-backed and UAE-backed Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. Rada al-Mutawakkil, co-founder of a human rights group in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, told the BBC that selling arms to the United States would be a green signal for them to continue their policies. They gather documentary evidence of airstrikes on civilian populations in Yemen. He said that so far he has compiled a record of about 500 such incidents. He said fragments of some of the bombs used in the attacks showed that most of them were American-made, some were made in Britain and one was Italian-made. Al-Mutawakkil, who also briefed the United Nations on human rights abuses and the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, said the countries attacking Yemen have full confidence in U.S. support and are satisfied that he will continue to provide them with weapons. Defense analyst Bronk says the UAE has long sought to obtain U.S. drones for use in Yemen. He said that these drones could be very effective in targeting the anti-aircraft guns of the Houthi rebels, as these drones can hit these cannons from a great height. According to the Dutch arms group Pax Group, Yemen is building a battlefield for the experimental use of drones. The Saudi-led military coalition has denied allegations that it targeted civilians in Yemen. A gathering of pro-Iranian mobs. Bronk says if the F-35s were sold to the UAE, other countries would want to buy them and a line would be set up. Some in Washington who want to avoid this situation say that Iran needs to address the proliferation of arms and the growing demand for Chinese weapons in the Middle East. The U.S. presidency has pursued an aggressive policy on arms sales to the Gulf states to benefit the U.S. arms industry. Last year, the U.S. president approved multi-billion-dollar arms deals with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, using presidential powers under emergency laws to avoid opposition from Congress. David Friedman, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, dismissed concerns about the sale of F-35s to the United Arab Emirates following agreements to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. He told the Jerusalem Post that it would take years for other countries in the region to reach Israel, which has a military and weapons advantage in the region, but a powerful ally on the shores of the Strait of Hormuz. Israel can benefit greatly from the support of. He said that the criticism was being made only by pro-Iranian elements. Experts believe that Iran is still increasing its defense capabilities despite the fact that its Air Force aircraft are getting older. Lieutenant Colonel Christine Ku, a defense expert at the Washington Institute and a U.S. Air Force lieutenant, says Tehran has spent the past decade building ballistic missiles, drones and cruise missiles. Experts do not agree that the deal with Israel will help the UAE speed up the sale of F-35s, as Congress may delay the deal and block it. Coming to power could also have an effect on it. Some in the UAE say focusing on arms deals reflects a skeptical mindset, while an agreement with Israel would promote cooperation and religious harmony in the region. A spokesman for the UAE embassy in London described the agreement with Israel as historic, saying it would boost economic prosperity, peace and religious harmony in the region. Peace and religious harmony in the region.